Hi there, my name is Lucas, and for this critical assignment, I decided to go back to the overview of anatomy lab that we did towards the beginning of the session and pick out a particular experiment involving the planes of the body. And in this experiment, we were instructed to create a clay model and cut the planes of the body into that anatomical clay model. So the purpose of this experiment was to understand the planes of the body, which are the transverse, sagittal, and frontal planes, and how they're involved in particular movements. One of the questions that came up were, can multiple planes be involved in the same movement, or do they have to work one at a time? What we needed to know coming into the experiment was that the transverse plane involves rotation of the hip, pelvis, ankle, anything rotating across this plane. We also need to know the sagittal plane, which is flexion, extension, forward and backward movements, and also the frontal plane, which involves abduction and adduction, side-to-side movements. So for the particular experiment, students were asked to form a miniature clay model mimicking the human in an anatomical position. So this is what I've done. This is my model. And once the model is made, students were asked to cut the model along the transverse, sagittal, and frontal planes. All you need for this experiment is something to cut with, a cutting board, and your clay model. As you can see, he's in an anatomical position. There's his nose, his ears, his hands are facing forward. He's ready to go. I'm gonna make a cut along the transverse plane. So I'm gonna cut him right here across the middle. And there we are. He's now cut across the transverse plane where rotation occurs. So next, I'm gonna be making a cut along the sagittal plane. So right down the middle, dividing the body into left and right sides. Here we go. Clay is a little bit sticky, but as you can see, a cut has been made across the sagittal plane. So lastly, I'll be making a cut along the frontal plane, which runs parallel to the front and back side of the body. This one's a little bit tricky, so let's try it out. There we are. The body is now cut along the frontal plane. So now that I've done the experiment and I've made these cuts to my model, I can now see exactly where that invisible line lies. I can see where the movements occur. So for instance, now that I've cut the sagittal plane, I can see that movements across the sagittal plane are forward and back, parallel to that invisible line in the middle. I can see that the transverse plane, movements across that would be rotational. There's that invisible line right there. And I can see that movements across the frontal plane, which divides the body to front and back, go left to right like that, side to side, abduction, adduction. With the cuts there, it is now much easier to see what movements occur along those planes. So I made a biblical connection to this experiment by referring back to creation and Genesis, and the fact that our purpose here was to cultivate and keep the Garden of Eden and ultimately God's kingdom. And with the structures we were given and their abilities to perform these complex movements across multiple planes, transverse, sagittal, frontal, it makes it so that purpose can be fulfilled. With understanding these planes and how they interact with one another, we can use our bodies to further serve that purpose.